Kna-B and KIA are today emerging as two of the most strategically positioned ethnic armed forces in Myanmar's evolving civil war. The Kuki National Army-Burma, Kna-B, operates along the western corridor connecting India's Manipur border to Myanmar's Sagaing region, while the Kachin Independence Army, KIA, dominates large parts of northern and southern Kachin state. Together, these two groups are shaping the direction of resistance along a vast geographic arc stretching from the Himalayan foothills to the Chindwin River basin. It is here, in this corridor that links Kachin's southern edge to the northwestern Sagaing frontier, that the future of the Myanmar Junta, so-called Plan of 2026, is being quietly, and perhaps decisively, contested. This corridor has gained new significance because it represents both a geographic and political connection between two resistance theatres that were once considered separate. The KIA's operations in southern Kachin have increasingly pushed southward, threatening junta lines that extend towards Sagaing, while the Kna-B's presence on the India-Myanmar border has allowed cross-flow of men, materials, and communication between frontier ethnic groups. In many ways, the Kachin-Sagaing linkage has become the backbone of the anti-junta resistance, stretching the military's overstretched resources and preventing it from consolidating power in preparation for its 2026 electoral roadmap. To understand why this corridor matters, one must grasp the nature of the junta's current strategy. The Plan of 2026, as described by military sources and analysts, is the regime's blueprint for transforming its fragile battlefield position into political legitimacy. The Military Council under Min Aung Hlaing envisions nationwide elections by late 2025 or early 2026 as a means to restore formal governance under a civilian facade, thereby stabilizing its image before the international community. This is not a return to democracy, but a managed transition designed to preserve military supremacy while masking it behind electoral procedures. For this to succeed, the junta must secure key territories across the country, particularly Kachin, Sagaing and the western border regions, so that elections appear nationwide rather than fragmented. This is where KIA and Kna-B cooperation becomes fatal to the plan. The KIA's control over southern Kachin disrupts the junta's logistics, cutting the northern approach routes, while Kna-B's growing footprint in the Sagaing-Tamu corridor blocks the western expansion of electoral administration. Together, they create a belt of resistance that makes the regime's vision of an orderly nationwide vote largely impractical. The Kachin Independence Army, long known for its disciplined structure and strategic acumen, remains one of the most powerful ethnic forces in Myanmar. Its operational theatre includes the mountainous borders of China and deep valleys of Kachin State, extending to northern Shan and touching the upper Sagaing front. In recent years, the KIA has been expanding southward from traditional bastions like Lhasa and Pakant toward Mansi, Barmo and further into areas where the junta hoped to establish Phase 2 election zones. Early in 2025, the KIA captured several army positions in Mansi Township, including Infantry Battalion 319 and 601, and an artillery unit numbered 523. These victories were not merely tactical but symbolic. They shattered the perception that the military still held cohesive control over these frontier zones. In southern Kachin, KIA forces have begun to link up with local People's Defence Forces and smaller ethnic militias, thereby forming a dense network of resistance across the Sagaing approach. This has complicated the junta's logistical operations because the area forms the northern terminus of its administrative corridor to Sagaing region. The KIA's command, known for its seasoned battlefield leadership, appears to be pursuing a deliberate plan, pushing southward while encouraging cross-border cooperation among anti-junta movements. Meanwhile, to the west, the Kuki National Army-Burma has carved a distinct but complementary role in this resistance landscape. Emerging from the Kuki armed movement that straddles both sides of the India-Myanmar border, the Kna-B operates in regions where ethnic Kuki-Chinese populations are concentrated. Its familiarity with the difficult hill terrain of the Tamu, Kalay, and Tonzang corridor has made it a significant factor in the junta's western theatre. Although less frequently reported than the KIA, the Kna-B has been active in supporting local PDFs and coordinating with other ethnic outfits. Open-source reports and community-based networks indicate that Kna-B cadres have been involved in defensive and logistical operations that indirectly assist resistance strongholds in Sagaing. What makes the Kna-B's role particularly sensitive is its cross-border dimension. India shares a porous frontier with Myanmar, and the events in Sagaing have a direct impact on security in Manipur and Mizoram. Arrests of KNA-linked cadres inside Indian territory have already drawn attention to the cross-border implications. However, the movement's military logic is unmistakable. By aligning with the broader anti-junta resistance, the Kna-B ensures that the junta cannot treat Western Myanmar as a secure rear base for electoral administration. This western corridor is now a zone of uncertainty, one that stretches the military thin across multiple fronts. The coordination, formal or informal, between the KIA and Kna-B is less about organizational merger and more about shared strategy. Both groups reject the junta's attempt to stage elections under the 2008 constitution, which reserves significant political power for the military regardless of electoral outcome. Both advocate for a genuinely federal democratic structure and autonomy for ethnic regions. While there is no verified Joint Command announcement from November 2025, patterns of battlefield deployment and communication indicate that these groups are at least coordinating in spirit, if not by a formal document. The resistance narrative emerging from both fronts reinforces this perception, that the path to federal democracy lies not through junta-managed ballots, but through sustained territorial denial. From the junta's perspective, this cooperation represents a nightmare scenario. The Myanmar military has historically relied on dividing ethnic fronts, isolating one from another through ceasefires or selective offensives. Now, with groups like the KIA, Kna-B and others indirectly synchronizing their resistance, that divide-and-rule model collapses. The southern Kachin and Sagaing belt effectively forms a continuous resistance zone where government troops face multi-directional attacks. The inability to establish administrative control in these areas means that even if the junta proceeds with its 2026 elections, vast territories will remain outside the voting process. This absence of national coverage will instantly delegitimize the election both domestically and internationally. Observers note that less than half of Myanmar's townships are securely under military control, and many of those are contested by night. Sagaing and Kachin are among the least stable. If resistance continues to expand through 2025, the junta's attempt to conduct elections in early 2026 will be, at best, symbolic, a performance of control rather than its reality. The elections would likely be recognized only in cities or regions garrisoned by the army, leaving the majority of ethnic areas under parallel administration by the resistance. The KIA's strategic positioning amplifies this crisis. Holding ground along the China-Myanmar border gives it leverage in trade routes and supply lines. Beijing's cautious engagement with both sides has allowed the KIA to sustain operations while maintaining de facto control over its territories. Its inclusion in the Central Command Coordination, C3C, a loose framework aligning EAOs with the National Unity Government, makes it the military backbone of the resistance. The KIA has already demonstrated its ability to seize and hold junta bases, and as 2025 unfolds, its push into the southern corridor threatens to merge with the Sagaing theatre, precisely where Kna-B and local PDFs maintain influence. This geographic synergy is crucial. If the KIA from the north and Kna-B from the west manage to sustain pressure across the Sagaing-Kachin axis, the junta will be unable to open safe routes for its convoys or ballot materials. Polling infrastructure, voter registration, and security arrangements all depend on stable supply lines. Resistance control over even a few key towns could paralyze the process entirely. Furthermore, the presence of multiple ethnic forces complicates the junta's intelligence operations, as each group maintains separate networks and operates in terrain where the army's movements are easily detected. For the resistance, this shared objective of denying the junta's political normalization has both ideological and pragmatic motivations. Ideologically, both groups consider the 2008 constitution and the junta's planned elections as tools of continued oppression. Pragmatically, denying the junta a political victory keeps international sympathy tilted toward the resistance, especially from Western democracies that have refused to recognize the military government. Every failure of the junta's 2026 plan strengthens the argument for an inclusive federal democracy, where ethnic groups hold autonomous power within a union framework. At the same time, risks abound. The junta's response to territorial losses has typically been brutal aerial bombardment and artillery strikes on civilian areas. If resistance gains continue through late 2025, the regime may intensify repression in an attempt to clear the way for elections. This would increase civilian casualties, displacements, and refugee flows into India, China, and Thailand. Already, the humanitarian crisis in Kachin and Sagaing has reached severe levels, with thousands crossing into India's border states. The Kna-B's operations in these border zones therefore have dual implications. They strengthen the resistance militarily, but also heighten India's security and humanitarian concerns. For India, these developments are delicate. New Delhi's Act East policy depends on a stable Myanmar for connectivity projects like the India-Myanmar-Thailand Highway and border trade through Moor and Tamu. However, as the Kna-B and allied resistance groups keep the Sagaing corridor volatile, trade routes remain closed or unsafe. At the same time, India must balance between not supporting the junta overtly while preventing its own border from becoming a safe haven for armed movements. This balancing act will become harder as the 2026 election nears and violence intensifies. From a regional perspective, the junta's 2026 strategy has already lost credibility. The military council speaks of restoring peace and democracy, yet continues to arrest opposition members and bomb ethnic regions. Its calls for international observers from friendly states such as Belarus or Russia are unlikely to convince ASEAN or Western nations. China, while maintaining pragmatic contact with both the junta and resistance, has little incentive to endorse a flawed electoral process that risks prolonging instability along its border. Thus, even if elections occur, their recognition will be limited, and resistance-controlled territories will continue to operate independently. Looking ahead, three scenarios seem plausible. First, the junta may push ahead with elections despite ongoing warfare. In such a case, Myanmar could split functionally into two systems: junta-controlled urban zones where ballots are staged, and rural resistance regions governed by EAOs and the NUG. Second, the resistance might achieve enough territorial expansion by mid-2025 to make nationwide elections logistically impossible. That would force the junta to either postpone the vote or risk an electoral farce with extremely low turnout. Third, under growing pressure, the regime might attempt a limited negotiation with major EAOs, offering concessions to secure participation. In that scenario, KIA and Kna-B could emerge as influential bargaining powers, shaping the future of Myanmar's federal framework. Yet any such negotiation depends on battlefield realities. For now, the momentum appears to favor the resistance. The KIA continues to capture bases, and the Kna-B, despite limited publicity, maintains a steady role along the border. Each success undermines the junta's narrative of control and complicates its path to 2026. The alliance, explicit or tacit, between northern Kachin fighters and western Kuki resistance has created a two-front challenge the junta cannot easily neutralize. As 2025 progresses toward the 2026 horizon, the southern Kachin Sagaing corridor will likely become one of the most contested theaters of Myanmar's modern conflict. For the resistance, it is a line of defense and expansion. For the junta, it is the last barrier to political legitimacy. The outcome of this confrontation will determine not only the fate of the military regime, but also the future shape of Myanmar's federal union, and by extension, the stability of India's northeastern frontier. The unfolding dynamics underscore that the junta plan of 2026 is less a roadmap to peace than a fragile political theatre built on incomplete control and coercion. The KIA and Kna-B, through their sustained defiance, ensure that the path to legitimacy remains blocked. Their coordination, spanning Kachin's mountains to Sagaing valleys, represents more than a military alliance. It is the assertion of ethnic self-determination against centralized militarism. Whether Myanmar moves toward a negotiated federal order or descends deeper into fragmentation will depend largely on how this resistance front evolves over the next year. For policymakers in India, China, and ASEAN, the message is clear. The stability of the region cannot be secured by recognizing a flawed election. It can only emerge through dialogue that includes the very forces now controlling ground realities: the KIA, Kna-B, and other ethnic organizations that continue to hold the keys to their respective territories. As such, the junta's 2026 plan appears increasingly untenable in the face of these expanding alliances, making the Kna-B and KIA forces are gradually emerging as the two crucial resistance pillars shaping the course of Myanmar's armed and political struggle along the northern and western frontier. Their growing presence in the southern part of Kachin state and the Sagaing corridor marks a convergence that has both tactical and symbolic importance. The southern Kachin Hills form the transitional zone between the high-intensity northern front and the complex patchwork of militias and PDFs operating through Sagaing. When the Kuki National Army-Burma began extending its cooperation networks into this zone, it effectively connected the resistance bridge from Kachin in the north to the India-Myanmar borderlands in the west. This corridor, stretching from Pakant through Indore to Tamu and Kalay, has now become one of the most strategically contested axes of the entire anti-junta campaign. From the perspective of field dynamics, the Kachin Independence Army continues to maintain well-entrenched control in several mountainous strongholds, relying on a decentralized command structure and sophisticated coordination through the Central Command Committee. The Kna-B, operating as a flexible border-based guerrilla network, provides reinforcement and logistics through Sagaing's ethnic corridors, where Kachin communities serve as both human terrain and natural buffer against the regime's patrols. Together, they have transformed this belt into an operational zone that restricts the junta's movements and denies the Tatmadaw the ability to hold sustained ground. The southern Kachin-Sagaing corridor is vital to the regime's 2026 election plan because it lies between two administrative regions that the military council aims to reintegrate for legitimacy purposes. In the junta's blueprint, these districts are supposed to host a second-phase voting operation early in 2026. Yet by November 2025, reports from local networks indicate that resistance elements, particularly the KIA and allied PDFs, have reoccupied or neutralized more than half of the polling townships. The Kna-B's entry into the same theater adds an unpredictable dimension: cross-border mobility, hidden supply chains from India's border hills, and a degree of resilience that regular Tatmadaw units find difficult to suppress. At the political level, the cooperation between Kna-B and KIA is more than a military alignment. It is a convergence of marginalized ethnic demands. Both movements reject the 2008 constitution and insist on a federal structure guaranteeing ethnic self-determination. For the Kachin, this is rooted in decades of betrayal by central authorities after broken ceasefire promises. For the Kachin forces, it represents a continuation of their historical resistance against assimilation and central neglect. This ideological symmetry explains why, even in the absence of formal declarations, the field coordination between them grows organically through local command interactions and shared logistical routes. Observers familiar with the situation in late 2025 describe the Sagaing corridor as a federated frontline. Each resistance cell maintains local autonomy while aligning its operations to strategic guidance disseminated by the KIA and the NUG-linked command councils. The Kna-B's inclusion in this framework demonstrates an expansion of the anti-junta coalition beyond central Myanmar into the ethnic borderlands, where the Tatmadaw's capacity is most overstretched. This has serious implications for the junta's 2026 timetable, which relies on a perception of restored order and political normalcy. To understand why this matters, one must view the junta's so-called 2026 plan as a combination of three elements: consolidation of military control, reconstruction of administrative presence, and an election to mask continued autocracy. Each of these depends on territorial stability. Yet, southern Kachin and Sagaing are precisely the regions where stability has collapsed. The KIA's offensive since early 2025 captured artillery bases, disrupting the army's supply chain to Sagaing. The Kna-B's incursions into the western flank diverted junta troops from their central operations. Together, they form a vice grip that limits the junta's reach northward and westward. Economically, these areas also host lucrative jade, timber and cross-border trade routes that the military relies on for revenue. Control by KIA and Kna-B deprives the junta of significant income streams. This is why the regime has doubled down on aerial bombardment campaigns, particularly in Indore and Kachin townships, but with limited success. The resistance's familiarity with the terrain, along with cross-border shelters, continues to frustrate the Tatmadaw's offensives. From a broader regional viewpoint, the KIA-Kna-B linkage alters security calculations for neighbouring India. Manipur's volatile hills are now not only domestic flashpoints, but also logistical extensions of Myanmar's internal war. Arms smuggling, refugee flows, and ethnic sympathies intertwine across the border. Indian agencies recognize that any escalation inside Sagaing can ripple into border districts, complicating counterinsurgency coordination on the Indian side. Thus, while the junta's election rhetoric seeks to portray progress, the reality is that its western flank remains a battlefield contested by forces beyond its immediate control. Diplomatically, the junta has sought to reassure China and ASEAN partners that the elections will bring order. Yet, China's relationship with the Kachin leadership is ambiguous. Beijing tolerates the KIA as long as its activities do not disrupt Chinese investments. The presence of the Kna-B in adjacent corridors, however, introduces another variable, since its ethnic kin across the border have no such leverage with China. This creates a triangle of interests where Beijing's cautious neutrality contrasts with India's silent anxiety and the junta's desperation for recognition. Throughout 2025, independent observers noted a shift in the resistance's operational doctrine from reactive defense to preemptive offensives. The KIA led coordinated assaults on key artillery regiments, while the Kna-B launched raids on junta outposts near Tamu. This strategic posture aims to maintain initiative and prevent the military from establishing secure bases for the upcoming election cycle. Every successful raid not only erodes the junta's confidence, but also weakens its claim that the situation is stabilizing. In propaganda terms, the regime, return to democracy, narrative is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The KIA's control over the southern Kachin pocket also serves as an anchor for the resistance's northern supply lines. It allows communication with NUG's PDF cells operating deep in Sagaing. The Kna-B's contribution ensures safe passage for personnel and materials through the India-Myanmar frontier. Together, this interconnected geography forms a semi-autonomous resistance belt where the junta's writ does not run. For the people living within it, local governance is often managed by revolutionary committees rather than military administrators. This parallel administration underscores the de facto fragmentation of Myanmar's political map, making the 2026 electoral calendar more of a symbolic gesture than a national event. Internally, the junta faces its own crises. Conscription drives have provoked resentment even among Bama heartlands, while morale among mid-level officers continues to decline. Many troops deployed in Sagaing are ill-trained or demoralized after heavy losses against KIA offensives. This explains why the Tatmadaw increasingly relies on aerial bombing and artillery shelling rather than ground engagement. But aerial dominance does not translate into territorial control. In every area vacated by junta forces, resistance committees quickly re-establish authority, ensuring the cycle of conflict continues. The longer-term picture toward 2026 suggests three potential outcomes. The first is a partial election held in secure areas, producing a nominal parliament that reinforces the junta's control, but fails to gain recognition. The second is a continued expansion of resistance territories, rendering the election impossible in more than half the country. The third is a forced negotiation, likely mediated through external actors, where EAOs including the KIA and Kna-B could bargain for constitutional reforms in exchange for ceasefire commitments. Each scenario hinges on developments in the Kachin-Sagaing axis, which has now become the decisive test of the junta's endurance. For ordinary civilians, the situation is devastating. Villages in Indore, Tijiang and Tamu corridors face bombardments, mass displacement and food shortages. Yet resistance morale remains high because these same communities see the KIA and Kna-B as protectors against forced conscription and taxation by the regime. Humanitarian agencies warn that prolonged conflict may trigger another wave of refugees toward India's Mizoram and Manipur, straining already limited capacities. These human consequences illustrate how the junta's political plans are detached from the ground realities of suffering and resistance. By late 2025, evidence suggests that the junta's electoral preparations in northern Sagaing have stalled. Officials sent to compile voter lists often flee after threats from local resistance cells. Communication networks are sabotaged and administrative buildings destroyed. The KIA's media statements highlight these as victories in denying legitimacy to the dictatorship. Meanwhile, the Kna-B's radio communiques emphasize ethnic solidarity and the unacceptability of a military-controlled democracy. The overlap of these messages reveals a shared understanding that 2026 is not merely an election year, but a battleground year for Myanmar's political soul. In analytical terms, the cooperation between KIA and Kna-B represents the practical fusion of northern and western theatres into one resistance front. This transformation undermines the junta's traditional divide-and-rule strategy, which relied on isolating ethnic rebellions geographically. For decades, conflicts in Kachin, Chin and Sagaing were treated as separate issues. Now, through operational cooperation and shared objectives, they function as a single continuum of insurgency. The result is that even if the junta manages token voting in urban pockets, its control over the countryside remains illusory. For the international community, the central dilemma persists: how to engage with a regime claiming legitimacy through elections that much of its own population rejects. Human rights organizations continue to warn that recognition of such a process would entrench dictatorship. At the same time, regional actors fear that a complete collapse of the junta could unleash uncontrollable fragmentation. The delicate balance of intervention and non-interference thus continues, while groups like KIA and Kna-B shape realities on the ground regardless of diplomatic hesitation. In summary, the emerging cooperation between the Kuki National Army-Burma and the Kachin Independence Army across southern Kachin and the Sagaing corridor has become a decisive obstacle to the Myanmar military's 2026 strategy. It demonstrates how localized ethnic struggles can converge into a coordinated national resistance capable of denying state authority. The junta's plan to convert battlefield stalemate into political legitimacy through staged elections is therefore collapsing under geographic, military, and moral pressure. The Sagaing-Kachin axis now symbolizes a broader truth. Myanmar's future cannot be engineered through ballots imposed by force, but must arise from an inclusive federal settlement, acknowledging ethnic aspirations and shared sovereignty. Disclaimer: this analysis is based on publicly available reports, regional field observations, and open-source data. It reflects independent editorial interpretation by ZalengamMedia and does not represent endorsement of any armed group or political actor. All media materials referred to are used under fair use and academic commentary principles for informational purposes only.
Kuki Army ke wo we kyo cho ke su thi nge ke tai ke bo lai bo we xong khỏi lột cho gạo vô từ ui chả tê lúc phụ hệ cho mà hi bazar kaya chi bôi firing bê đó hồi cái gì nào nổ mong nghe cây lê cái chứ drone bom này nó sát đạn này nhì lắm à đà thâu này nhì lắm cái đà này drone bom nhì lắm